Hi, this is Matt Baker. Welcome to part 3 in my series on the psychology of atheism, in which I've been summarizing my PhD dissertation. In part 1, I talked about terminology, and in part 2, I shared the main results from my research, which had to do with comparing the personalities of atheist church leavers with those of theist church remainers. If you haven't yet watched parts 1 and 2, I'll leave links to them in the description. Basically, my theory is that personality plays a major role in why some people become atheists while others do not. And what I found was that those who score the combination TP on the Myers-Briggs are the most likely to become atheists, which happens to correlate with low agreeableness and low conscientiousness on the Big Five. However, I also wanted to test whether or not one's basic personality profile was a better predictor of atheism than some of the other theories that have been suggested over the years. In particular, I wanted to test several of the rather insulting theories that are often put forward by conservative Christians, such as the idea that atheists are simply immoral or arrogant or angry, or that they had absent fathers. So in this episode, I'm going to share with you what I learned from this part of my research. So if you're an atheist, you may have had the unfortunate experience of having someone try to push this book on you, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. In the book, the author writes that when he was young, what held him back from becoming a Christian was the self-serving and immoral lifestyle that I would be compelled to abandon if I were ever to change my views and become a follower of Jesus. I would have to give up many pleasures and a good deal of time and some money. Obviously, becoming religious would be a real inconvenience. So basically, he's claiming that most people who are atheists are simply selfish. They're just too busy being immoral to have time for God. This, of course, is ridiculous. There are plenty of atheists out there who dedicate lots of time and money to charitable causes. And there are plenty of religious people who do immoral and selfish things, like cheat on their partners or ignore those in need. Several scientific studies have tried to measure immorality alongside religiosity, but as a whole, the results have gone both ways, indicating that there's no real connection between moral behavior and belief in God. For my own study, I decided to include a very basic measure of selfishness based on statements taken from a public domain research tool called the IPIP, or International Personality Item Pool. I'll leave a link to the IPIP website in case you're interested to learn more. And I'll remind you that my two sample groups consisted of 10,525 atheists who grew up attending church but then left, and 1,977 theists who grew up attending church and remained. So what I discovered was that as a whole, the theists who took my survey scored low on selfishness, and that the atheists as a whole scored low as well. But more importantly, I was able to conclude that the difference between the mean scores of the two groups was not large enough to support the claim that selfishness plays a major role in why some people become atheists. Another thing that atheists are often accused of is being arrogant. For example, in this book, What's So Great About Christianity, author Dinesh D'Souza writes that atheists presume that their rational scientific approach gives them full access to external reality. It is this presumption that gives atheism its characteristic arrogance. Atheists are dogmatic and arrogant, whereas believers are modest and reasonable. Okay? Well, I decided to test this theory using another scale from the IPIP, one that measured arrogance. And yet again, what I discovered was that the difference in mean scores was not large enough to support the claim that arrogance plays a major role in why some people become atheists. In fact, in this case, it was simply males in general, regardless of whether or not they believed in God, that stood out as being more arrogant, on average, than females. The next thing I tested was anger. It's a common belief among some Christians that it's not that atheists do not believe in God, it's that they are simply angry with God, perhaps because of certain difficult situations that they have faced in their lives. Now, I wasn't able to test anger at God directly, but I was able to test anger in general, again by using a scale from the IPIP. And what I found was that anger doesn't appear to play a major role in why some people become atheists. This backs up what two key scholars in the field, Bob Altemeyer and Bruce Hunsberger, discovered in their groundbreaking study published in their book Amazing Conversions: Why Some Turn to Faith and Others Abandon Religion. They studied those who grew up in highly religious homes yet became atheists, as well as those who grew up in non-religious homes yet became theists. And what they found was that the vast majority of atheists, quote unquote, convert to atheism for intellectual reasons, not emotional ones. In contrast, it was those who converted to religion who often did so for emotional reasons, usually due to some serious personal problem that they were facing around the time of their conversion. And ironically, Altemeyer and Hunsberger concluded that it was the strong emphasis on truth and integrity taught in church that led most of the atheists in their study to abandon their belief in God. In other words, they found that atheists are in fact extremely dedicated to finding the truth. And when they discover that what their church is teaching simply doesn't stand up under scrutiny, they will follow where they think the truth is leading them, even if it comes at a personal cost. Which is interesting because in this famous book, C.S. Lewis wrote, "If you examined 100 people who had lost faith in Christianity, I wonder how many of them would turn out to have been reasoned out of it by honest argument. Do not most people simply drift away?" Now, I happen to be a big fan of C.S. Lewis, and Narnia in particular, but I gotta say, he's flat out wrong here. Researchers have examined 100 people, and it turns out that honest argument is in fact what caused most of them to lose faith. Okay, so the final theory that I wanted to test was the one put forward by Paul Vitz in his book, Faith of the Fatherless: The Psychology of Atheism. In this book, Vitz argues that people become atheists due to poor or non-existent relationships with their fathers. So, for example, he points out that Freud had a very weak father, and that Nietzsche lost his father at age 5. But what he doesn't do is provide any empirical data on the subject. So I decided to collect it for him. And here's what I found. First of all, the female atheists did in fact experience the death of a father more often than the female theists, at a level that was considered to be statistically relevant. However, the male atheists did not. And when it came to the overall strength of the father-child relationship, the atheist group, both female and male, did in fact score a bit lower on average than the theist group, again at a level that was considered to be statistically relevant. However, it's important to point out that it's impossible to know whether or not it was the weak relationship that led to the atheism or the atheism that led to the weak relationship. Because of this, I decided to do one more statistical test in order to find out how important the father-child relationship really was. The test that I used is called a binary logistic regression. And basically, it is used to test several variables at once to see which one is the most important. So in this case, I tested the data I had gathered on the father-child relationship alongside the data I had gathered on personality type, as well as 3 other variables that I had discovered to be important: intellect, years of church attendance, and overall church experience. And here are the results. The important number is the one in the last column. The closer that number is to 1, the less important that variable is. So you can see that relationship with father resulted in a score of 1.01, which is very close to 1. So in other words, when you control for the other variables, relationship with father has very little impact on whether someone is going to be an atheist or a theist. In contrast, a personality preference for TP on the Myers-Briggs scored 2.0, which means that when you control for everything else, the odds of someone with a preference for TP being an atheist rather than a theist is 2 to 1. To put it another way, if you're an INTP, for example, you're twice as likely to be an atheist than an ESFJ. However, if you had a bad relationship with your father, that doesn't seem to matter. The other 3 variables appear to matter a little bit, but nowhere near as much as you might expect. So those with a strong intellect are a little bit more likely to be an atheist, as are those who spent fewer years in church and those who had a more negative experience in church. However, the most important variable by far was a personality preference for TP, which is what I discussed in depth in the previous episode. So yeah, it would appear that atheists as a whole are not any more immoral, arrogant, or angry than theists. And it's not their relationship with their father that leads them to atheism. It's much more likely that it's simply their personality. Like I said last time, people who prefer T and P like to make decisions based on logic and aren't afraid to change their minds. So, building on the work of Altmaier and Hunsberger, the best explanation for why some people become atheists, even when they have grown up attending church, is that those people are simply dedicated to finding the truth in a very scientific way, and that they're not afraid to change their minds if they think they need to do so. So that was a look at the psychology of atheism and a bit of what I learned while working on my PhD dissertation. Keep in mind, however, that these 3 episodes were a bit oversimplified. So if you want to read the actual paper, I've linked to it in the description. Thanks for watching.